10 years had passed since laughter last touched the wooden walls of his cabin. 10 years since he had spoken more than a few words to anyone but himself. The mountains surrounding his ranch were his only companions, their snow-capped peaks eternal and indifferent, just as they had been the day his world ended. In the early mornings, Elias would saddle his horse before the sun broke the horizon. He rode through the misty fields, counting cattle, mending fences, moving with a patience that came not from peace but from weariness. His life was work, and work was his way of forgetting. At night, he sat by the fire with nothing but the creak of the timbers and the whisper of the wind to answer him. Once he had been a man with hope. Once he had knelt in a church, waiting for a bride who never arrived, the crushed promise of a future that vanished in a single afternoon. Since then, the ranch had been his prison and his refuge. He neither left nor welcomed anyone in. But fate, as it often does, came knocking when least expected. The night was fierce with storm. Rain hammered the roof, and wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal. Elias sat at his table, sharpening his knife. 3 soft knocks, hesitant but real. He froze, staring at the door. No one came here, no one. He rose slowly, suspicion prickling his skin. When he pulled the heavy door open, lightning split the sky and revealed a figure crumpled on his porch. Mud streaked the torn folds of a once beautiful gown, its red fabric clinging to her as if trying to hold her together. Elias caught her just before she fell against the wooden boards. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. For the first time in years, his heart surged with something sharp and alive: alarm, urgency, the need to protect. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold he had vowed none would cross again. The fire crackled as he laid her gently before it. Who was she? What storm had driven her to his door? The questions spun, but there would be no answers tonight, only the mystery of a bride in red, delivered by thunder to the loneliest man in the valley. For hours, Elias sat close to the fire. The flames licked her wet gown, drying it in slow patches, but her lips still carried the bluish tinge of cold. Elias fetched a blanket from his bed, rough wool but warm, and draped it around her shoulders. He was careful, almost reverent, as though afraid she might vanish if he touched her too roughly. He had not cared for another soul in a decade. His hands were used to rope and iron, not to tending someone fragile. And yet, the instincts came back, remnants of the man he once was, the man who had dreamed of a wife and family. He placed water to her lips, coaxed her to swallow, and sat back when her eyelids fluttered, but did not open. The storm outside grew wild. Rain rattled against the shutters, wind clawed at the cabin. But Elias's gaze never strayed from the woman. Questions pressed at his mind. Why was she alone in these mountains? Why dressed in such a gown, torn and dirt-streaked, as though she had run for miles? Why collapse here, of all places, on the porch of a forgotten rancher? At last, near dawn, the fury of the storm eased. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the pop of the fire. The woman stirred. Her lips parted, her breath quickened, and slowly her eyes opened. Elias leaned forward. She looked around in confusion, her gaze darting across the cabin, then fixed on him. For a moment, she shrank back, as if expecting harm. Elias raised his hands slightly, palms open. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough from long disuse. "You collapsed on my porch." Her throat worked as she tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. Elias poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. "Clara." Elias nodded. Clara. The name felt strange on his tongue, a new sound in a house that had known only silence. "You should rest," he muttered, though his mind burned with questions. But Clara's eyes, wide and haunted, held his. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't let them find me." Elias felt the words sink into him like a blade. He had lived 10 years as though the world beyond his fence no longer existed. Now, in one storm-tossed night, that world had come crashing to his door, in the form of a frightened bride with secrets, heavy enough to draw enemies into his solitude. And though he didn't yet know it, his life would never again return to silence. Clara slept fitfully through the day, her body weak and shivering despite the fire's warmth. Elias busied himself with chores around the cabin, though his eyes drifted back to her again and again. He tried to work as he always had, mending a saddle strap, chopping wood, feeding the stock, but each task felt different now, colored by the knowledge that someone else lay within those walls. For 10 years, his cabin had been a place of echoes and dust. Now, every sound she made. By evening, she stirred again. Elias had set stew simmering in a pot, the scent of venison and herbs curling through the air. She hesitated, as though unused to kindness, then began to eat in small, careful bites. "You've been through a storm," Elias said, his voice quiet but steady. "No one stumbles this far into the mountains without a reason." Clara's spoon froze midway to her lips. Her gaze lifted to him, uncertain. For a long moment she seemed to wrestle with words. Then she lowered the bowl into her lap. "I had to leave," she whispered. "There was no other choice." Elias waited. He had learned patience from years of watching cattle and weather. Clara's voice was raw, carrying both exhaustion and fear. "They wanted me to marry a man I did not love." Knuckles white. "I ran before the vows could be finished. I ran, and I didn't look back." Her eyes shimmered with something Elias recognized too well. Grief for a life she had not chosen. "Did someone follow you?" he asked. Clara nodded faintly. "They won't stop until they find me." "He won't stop." A chill settled over Elias, heavier than the storm outside. He had believed his solitude made him untouchable. But this woman, this stranger, had brought danger to his doorstep. And yet as he looked at her, sitting wrapped in his blanket, fragile and trembling, but defiant enough to run through a storm, Elias felt something stir within him. A memory of the man he had once been. A man who would have stood and fought for the woman he loved. "No one's going to harm you while you're under my roof." Clara's lips parted as though to protest, then closed again. For the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders relaxed. Outside, the mountains slept beneath a veil of mist. But Elias knew the peace would not last. Somewhere beyond the ridges, riders might already be searching, their trail leading straight toward his lonely cabin. And with that thought, Elias Carter realized that the silence he had clung to for a decade was over. His life was no longer his own. The next 2 days passed in uneasy rhythm. Clara's strength began to return. Though the weight of fear still shadowed her every movement, she moved about the cabin cautiously, as if uncertain whether she belonged in its silence. Elias, too, was unsettled. He had lived 10 years in the company of cattle, storms, and his own ghosts, not with a stranger whose very presence filled the rooms with a restless energy. At dawn, Elias worked the fields as usual, his axe striking clean against wood, the sound echoing through the frosted air. But his eyes never stopped sweeping the horizon. Each crow that lifted from the treetops, each distant echo of hooves carried with it the question, were they coming? Clara often watched him from the porch, her blanket drawn around her shoulders. The fire in her eyes was stronger now. Yet Elias noticed the tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking. She was trying to be brave, though the storm outside had merely shifted into a storm within. One evening, as Elias returned from mending a broken gate, he found her standing by the hearth. She was staring at a photograph on the mantel, a faded image of a younger Elias beside a smiling woman with kind eyes. His chest tightened at the sight. That photograph hadn't been touched in years. "She was your bride," Clara said softly, not turning to look at him. Elias froze. The ache in his chest was sudden, sharp, as though the years had not dulled it at all. "She was," he answered simply. Clara traced the edge of the frame with her fingertips. "You lost her." His silence was answer enough. The air between them grew heavy, filled with things neither dared say aloud. At last, Elias stepped forward, taking the frame from her hands and placing it back where it belonged. "Some things can't be changed," he muttered. Clara lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." But when he looked at Clara, the mud-stained gown, the bruises on her arms, the way her eyes still flicked nervously toward the windows, he felt a kinship he had not expected. They were both survivors of promises broken, of lives torn apart by forces beyond their choosing. That night, Elias laid out his rifle and checked its chamber, oiling it with slow, steady hands. Clara watched him, her voice low. "They'll come here, won't they?" Elias didn't meet her eyes. "If they've tracked you this far, they won't stop now." A long silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then Clara said, almost in a whisper, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Elias paused, setting the rifle aside. His gaze met hers, steady, unwavering. "Because once, I needed saving too, and no one came." Clara's eyes filled, but she said nothing. The storm outside had passed, yet in that cabin, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that would soon test them both. The third morning dawned gray and brittle, a silence hanging over the valley that made Elias uneasy. The air was too still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, not of weather, but of men. He saddled his horse at first light and rode the ridge above the ranch. From there he could see the sweep of pine, forest and the narrow trail that cut toward the mountains. Hooves, at least 3 sets, pressed deep into the damp earth. Whoever hunted Clara had crossed into his land. Elias studied the trail for a long moment, jaw tight. Then he turned his horse back toward the cabin. The solitude he had clung to for a decade was gone now. The world had found him again. She looked up quickly, reading his expression before he said a word. "They're close, aren't they?" Elias didn't soften the truth. "Too close." Her fingers tightened around the cup until her knuckles whitened. "You should let me go. If I leave now, maybe they'll follow me and leave you in peace." Elias shook his head. "If you ride out there alone, you won't last an hour. They'll catch you, and worse, they'll know you came through here. I don't intend to hand you back to them, and I sure as hell don't intend to invite wolves to my doorstep." Clara's eyes glistened, but there was steel beneath the tears. "You don't know what kind of man he is." Elias leaned his rifle against the wall, his voice calm but steady. "I don't need to. I can see what he's done to you." His gaze flicked to the faint bruises on her arm, marks she still tried to hide beneath the torn folds of her dress. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The fire cracked softly, the only sound between them. At last, she whispered, "I never asked for a savior, and I never asked for a bride to collapse on my porch," Elias replied. His voice carried a rough edge, but not unkind. "Yet here we are." That night, Elias set to work as he hadn't in years. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking shutters, securing doors. He stacked wood near the fire and laid ammunition on the table. The movements were second nature, like a part of himself he had buried but never forgotten. Clara watched quietly, her eyes following him as he worked. She had seen men posture, boast, threaten, but Elias was different. He prepared in silence, each action deliberate, each motion a promise. As darkness fell, a low unease settled in the cabin. Beyond the windows, the night pressed heavy, the forest whispering with unseen movement. Clara pulled her blanket tight, her breath shallow. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the black line of the horizon. It had been 10 years since he last fought for anything. Tonight, he knew that peace was over. And somewhere out there, the riders were drawing closer.